Quite a tricky passage to prepare today. I think I could have easily made this 2 or 3 times longer than it's going to be, but I thought being here for 3 hours would be a bit much. It did mean, unfortunately, Nikki, I had to cut out all the jokes, which she did say last week she looks forward to. Our wrongdoing, our broken behaviours and attitudes are described in the Bible using 3 ideas: sin, iniquity, and transgression. To a degree, these words can be and are used interchangeably, at least partly because any particular behaviour may be more than one kind of wrong. When the Bible speaks of transgression, it speaks of breaking of covenant, of trust, of promises. When it speaks of iniquity, it speaks of behaviour that is crooked, unjust, and unfair. When it speaks of sin, it speaks of missing the mark. That's what the word means. Going in the wrong direction, to fail. This can just, in a larger sense, be purely practical. Falling short of a goal, failing an exam, these would be sin with that understanding. But applied to us in its fullest sense, it takes on a deeper meaning. And we'll see how that applies here in Joshua. We are made in God's image. We are made to know him and to follow him, to glorify him and enjoy him forever. That is our chief purpose. The fact that every other human being is also made in his image is something that should fundamentally govern how we see and treat other people. To sin is to fall short of living like these things are true. Cheating on my wife isn't sin because God created an arbitrary list and that one made the cut. It's sin because it fails to live up to God's image, his example of faithfulness. Because it fails to demonstrate that same faithfulness towards another image bearer of God, with obviously a whole lot of other destructive consequences too. Lying or hiding the truth is sin because it goes directly against God's image as truth. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And lying fails to treat an image bearer of God as they should be treated. The Bible is clear on the fact that all have sinned. Every human who has walked on this planet, unless they were Jesus of Nazareth. All have fallen short of God's standard of living up to being bearers of his image. This doesn't just mean doing things that are obviously wicked, things that are outwardly evil, like some moustache-twirling villain of the week, creating dastardly plots on a regular basis. The danger of sin isn't that it's ugly, but that so often it appears to be good on some level, nice, kind, reasonable, necessary, pleasurable, even loving. How things make us feel, how they appeal to us physically, practically or emotionally. These cannot be the measure by which we determine what is good. They cannot be the measure by which we determine whether we are meeting God's standards. If our desire is to live for God, the God revealed through Jesus Christ, then the Bible and teaching which has as its foundation the Bible must be the basis for determining if we are doing it. Now, the point isn't to burden ourselves with attempts to become good enough for God, to get onto that never-ending treadmill of trying to earn God's favour and love. We know as Christians that we are treated as good enough, as right with God, through and only through Jesus. Our confidence, our faith, is that he was perfect in his love for God and other people. Our faith is that his death was sufficient to pay the price for our sin because he was perfect. Our faith is that his resurrection demonstrates that we are no longer trapped in our sin or living in the shadow of death. No, the point isn't merely that we have to try harder, but that we recognize the insidious, deceitful, and corrupting nature of sin. How it slides into our lives at the height of our greatest victories and brings us low. How it looks so reasonable. How our desires can blind us to the nearness and reality of God. So far, the book of Joshua has shown us God's power over nature and over what people have built. It has shown us God's acceptance of outsiders with the woman Rahab, who wasn't part of Israel but ended up becoming the great and so on grandmother of Jesus. It has shown us amazing things happening when people trusted God. God created a nation of his own, rescuing them, making a way through the River Jordan and into the land he had promised them. But what happens next serves one main purpose. Our reading this morning serves one main purpose. It is a warning. The way that God deals with Achan and Israel was a warning to those who saw it firsthand. It was a warning to the people of Israel that would read about it later on, and it now serves as a warning to us. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan took some of them, so the Lord's anger burned against Israel. But now that word puts us straight back into our context, Jericho. Specific instructions were given to the nation of Israel regarding Jericho. March around it 6 days, check. Follow a particular order of march, check. Blow the trumpets and give a loud shout, check. Protect Rahab, check. Keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. Fail. There is absolutely no question that the instructions to Israel were clearly understood. The warning about devoted things, the things that were to be put aside for God's purposes, were no less clear. These things belonged to God. If they took them, if they stole them, they would bring trouble upon Israel. So we see in the following verses that Joshua sends out more spies, this time to Ai. The text gives us a 3-point comparison. Before Jericho, Joshua listened to God and is victorious. Before the first battle at Ai, he listens to men and is defeated. In chapter 8, as Duncan will deal with next week, Joshua listens to God and is victorious. Joshua falls short as a leader. Listening to people is good, but being directed by God is the standard. Here, Israel arrogantly attacks with a smaller army and is defeated, running away after losing a relatively few men, about 1% of the people they took. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. The elders of Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their heads. And Joshua said, "Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name? Oh Lord, you are doing terrible things. Why are you doing this to us? It's not fair. Other nations will see this, and it will be shameful for you and for us." Joshua, for all his godly characteristics, he is a type and shadow of the greater Saviour who was to come. Still, Joshua faces this first defeat with predictable frustration and anger. Predictable because it's something I'm sure many of us have seen more than once, including perhaps in ourselves. Anger and frustration at the consequences of our own sin. Consequences that we ourselves have created. Joshua might humble his body, but his lips tell a different story. So what is God's response to that? The Lord said to Joshua, "Stand up. What are you doing on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they've been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction." Achan did what he did, knowing on some level the risk that he was exposing, not just himself to, but all of Israel. And regarding his family, who we will see also suffered because of his sin, God declared twice in the law the principle that a person's sin could affect his family to the third or fourth generation. Put more plainly, a person's sin could affect every generation of his family who could reasonably be alive during his lifetime. Achan knew what God had said. He knew to some degree or another the God that Israel followed. And Achan made his choice anyway. He ignored or disbelieved that there could be consequences for what he did, that God would know. There are three options here. Achan acted like God was stupid, that he could hide this. Or maybe he thought that God was impotent, that God would be powerless to do anything about it. Or the third option is that he thought his sin was a small one. It was unimportant in the grand scheme of things, justifying to himself that this was okay, inconsequential largely, something that doesn't really hurt anyone. He was wrong. One of the internal dangers that the church in the West faces is that we as a culture are very individual in our focus. How am I affected by this? What does this do for me? How does this fit into my priorities? What can the church do for me? How can it serve my needs? Now, these are valid questions. None of them should be ignored, but they only give us half the picture from God's perspective. Time and again in the scriptures, we are shown that we are intended to be part of something bigger. Acting as though we exist separately from the larger body has no basis in God's declared will. Achan sinned, and his sin led directly to loss and death for Israel. Our actions and inaction impact the group, the church. Look again at God's words. Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. Go back to verse 1. Who did God say was unfaithful? Achan? No, Israel. Who did God's anger burn against? Not Achan, but Israel. Look again at verse 11. Israel have sinned. They have violated. They have taken. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them. This isn't an either-or situation. Achan was a problem, and so was the nation. Look again at how Joshua spoke in verse 7. Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Does that remind you of anything? Listen to the Israelites complaining to Moses when they are trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the desert. Oh, if only we could go back. If only we were where we were before. What was in the heart of Joshua's Israel when all of this was happening? We're not the generation that fell in the wilderness. We're not the ones who failed. We made it into the promised land. We have become the nation that God called us to be. If you were to read ahead a couple of verses from today's passage, and I'm not treading on Duncan's toes because this one's not being covered next week, you would see that God had all of Israel present themselves, tribe by tribe, then clan by clan, then family by family, until it is man by man, pulling Israel up and making them stop and think about their behavior and attitude was probably at the heart of why God narrowed down the guilty party to Achan in this way. He didn't just point to Achan outright, although God could have. He could have just said to Joshua, "It is this man." But instead, he had the whole nation present themselves, like a national identity parade. As they're all waiting, as the finger of blame slowly points at smaller and smaller groups, how many of them are wondering, did I do something? Am I part of the problem? Now, just as we must be individuals who examine ourselves, weighing our attitudes and behaviours against the plumb line of the Scriptures and good biblical teaching, so too must we be a body who examine ourselves. And something that Duncan has sent out to the church council members to consider before our next meeting is this document. And these are the questions that we must consider together as a church council. What are we good at doing as a church? What are we doing regularly but not doing very well? What are the key weaknesses in the life of the church? What are the key mission opportunities for the church? What are the threats to the church? And how can we ensure our limited resources are best used? But it is not only the responsibility of the church council to examine ourselves, to examine how the church is going, but each of us. With grace and humility, question and challenge the direction and the activities of the church. Speak to Duncan or other members in leadership. Take part. Use your voice. And the role of the leaders is to listen, but ultimately to be directed by what is in line with God and His standards. Sin isn't just using violent actions and words. It's not just lying and cheating. It's falling short of what we have been called to as individuals and as a church. These questions are designed to help us see where we are falling short as a church, as a group, as one body, in our service to each other and in our service to the community. We cannot adopt standards and practices that have no basis in what God has said or in the example He has given to us. We do not seek to earn our salvation or God's love, but we must seek to be the people that He has called us to be, to do the works that He has prepared in advance for us to walk in. I wasn't sure how to finish today, and it's quite unnerving to come to a sermon and not quite knowing how it's actually going to end. So I was very thankful when we opened with our first hymn, and it had these words: "Come, those who tell of battles won, and those struggling in the fight. For His perfect love will never change. and his mercies never cease. These words, this challenge about sin, about falling short as individuals and as a church, about making sure we are living up to the standards that God has set. These can be hard words, but in our defeat there is hope. In our sin there is grace. There was more than one battle at Ai, as we'll read about next week. When Satan tempts me to despair and tells me of the guilt within, upward I look and see him there, who made an end to all my sin. Thank you.